Здравствуйте, товарищи. Welcome back to Russian Through Propaganda. We're on day 2, and so we're going to talk more today about issues with pronunciation. Yesterday on day 1, of course, we went through the Cyrillic alphabet and learned basically the basic sound that each letter represents. And I think you'll get used to that with a couple of difficulties in terms of interference from English or letters that are unfamiliar. With a little practice, most students learn the alphabet fairly quickly. And you may have noticed, hopefully, that the Russian alphabet is pretty straightforward. Again, much more so than the way we spell words in English, right? So we should think generally that Russian Cyrillic has a one letter, one sound principle. But there are some really important exceptions, and we touched on a couple of those on day one. So today we're going to look at the really important ones in more detail, and we'll kind of clean up some less important examples of that on day 3. Okay, so today we're going to structure the lesson according to 5 keys to good Russian pronunciation. Uh, Maybe there should be 6. The first one, of course, is just knowing the alphabet and knowing the basic sounds. But today we're looking at 5 things that are really important for mastering Russian pronunciation. The first one is an easy one, vowel purity. So we talked about that a little bit yesterday. And this is fairly simple, although it will take some practice to probably eliminate some tendencies you have from speaking English. Remember, vowel purity simply means that Russian vowels are pure. They're one sound and one sound only. So we have a letter on the page that represents a vowel. That letter is representing a pure vowel sound, only one sound. That means that we could hold that sound indefinitely. For example, ah, right? That's an unchanging sound, one sound only. It's not shifting or gliding almost imperceptibly between multiple sounds, as is often the case with certain English vowels. Okay, so the real difficulty here are 2 vowels. We mentioned yesterday, or, right, the Russian O, or, and oo. Okay, so think about O. You can even see the way I'm pronouncing the letter in English, O, that there's sort of some funny business going on here, right? So practice Russian O is or, 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 right? And meanwhile, the second letter that causes problems, and this is probably the worst one, is ooh, right? Looks like a Y again. But again, English speakers go to make that sound and they want to say something like ooh or you, right? So both of those are not correct. Now, sometimes with this, I'll give silly examples, like one that's kind of silly. It may help you kind of remember this issue. Is imagine you're in elementary school or something and you're trying to gross each other out, and someone says something like, ooh, gross, right? Ooh, gross. Okay, those are the 2 vowels we're concerned with, right? Instead of saying ooh, saying something more like ooh, and instead of saying or, saying something like oh, gross, gross. Okay, that example may seem kind of silly, but the issue here is that if you do this only a little bit when you're speaking Russian, it can sound ridiculous. Like, so even though for learning purposes here, I may sort of be going a bit over the top, or it may sound that way. This is such a serious issue. Whenever students are starting out and they do this, it just immediately rежет слух, as they say in Russian, meaning literally it cuts your ears, it cuts at your ears because it sounds so odd. So watch out for these 2 letters, oo, or, and just work on it. And again, hopefully your instructor will point out if you're violating this rule consistently. Okay, so let's look at a few examples here. So look at the first one and maybe quiz yourself. This Russian word for well, right? A very common kind of a filler word. Okay, give it a try. Okay, did you say new? Well, that would be incorrect, right? It's nu, 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 right? Nu, right? You can hold that sound all day. Okay, next one. The word for pen. Try it. Did you say ruchka or something? Okay, well, I'm overdoing it there. There I use the English R and the vowel. This in Russian is ruchka, ruchka, right? So try to trill your R and then say ru, ru, not ru or ru or anything like that. Okay, so those are common mistakes. Okay, a few more. Je vous, not je veux, or something to that effect. And finally, universitet. Okay, we mentioned that yesterday. When you have an initial u in Russian, a lot of, especially if it's a borrowed word or something like this one, English speakers are going to want to say u, like university. Okay, so you may have never thought about that. How bizarre is that we write u, but we say university, right? Well, there's nothing like that in Russian, universitet. And so again, there's a good example of how in Russian, for the most part, what you see is what you get in terms of the way we're spelling the words. Okay, let's look at the other vowel that presents difficulties, o, kto. Okay, so don't say kto, 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 metro, metro, subway. Urok. Okay, there you have both sounds. Urok, urok, not urok. Urok. Finally, remember that E with the dots over it, that's yor, right? So that's the soft version of the same vowel sound we're talking about. And so the word for everything, give it a try. Well, it's not всё, it's всё, всё, всё. Okay, so we'll keep practicing that. Again, now it's worth pointing out what issues today are really, is it an issue of you can't produce this sound, or is it simply kind of a matter of discipline and interference from English? These two vowels we just talked about, oo and o, most people are perfectly capable of making those sounds. So this isn't really a pronunciation issue per se. It's more overcoming these tendencies that we have from English. Later today, of course, we'll see some sounds that are new to us, and the issue really is learning to pronounce a completely unfamiliar sound. Okay, the next issue we also talked about yesterday, and it's fairly straightforward, although as time moves on, we'll see that this is going to be a huge issue. And as I mentioned, it's really one of the most difficult things about learning Russian, and that is stress. Okay, so this means basically that one syllable per word in a Russian word is going to be clearly emphasized over all the others. So whereas in English, stress is relatively weak and can be a little bit shifty when you're trying to pin it down, even for a native speaker, in Russian, this is not the case. And so again, my advice to students is to watch for the underlined syllable in our textbook and really try to hit it with great force without being afraid of overdoing it. Because again, it's almost impossible to overdo this when you're first learning the Russian. Okay, so let's look at a couple of examples. And again, just watch for that underlined syllable. And again, pump your fist or pound the table or whatever if that helps you kind of nail down that stress in the Russian word. Группа, группа, not группа, right? So you see how, because the stress is so emphatic, misplacing it will reduce it, will result in something that sounds very different. Группа, студент, студент, right? Not student, студент. Машина, machina, right? Not machina and not machina. Machina. And finally, here's a relatively long word, universitet. Okay, that's a bit tricky because the stress is on the ending, on the final syllable, and we have to sort of wait. We have to be patient and really pound that final syllable, right? Universitet. Okay, so there are as many ways to mispronounce the Russian word with regard to stress as there are syllables in the word, right? You could say universitet, 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 universitet. Those are all incorrect, right? The correct version is universitet, universitet, with the stress on the final syllable. Okay, this is another thing. We talked yesterday about how sometimes your ear can sort of trick you, and it's not attuned to certain features, phonetic features of a new and unfamiliar language. So stress is one issue here. Even though it's so emphatic in Russian, a lot of students don't really hear it very well at first. It takes practice. So the issue again here on day 2 is really just to be aware of it and really pay attention to it. It's a huge mistake to think that this doesn't really matter. This is so important that you should really learn the stress. It's almost as important as knowing how to spell the word. Right, so sometimes it's easy to get the idea, oh, well, it doesn't really matter. I'll just kind of speak in monotone and sort of give every syllable equal stress and hope no one notices. That's just a mistake. So try not to do that. Again, it's easy to say that, but it's another matter of sort of being disciplined about it. But I've had students even well into year 2 who they seem to pay no attention whatsoever to where the stress is, and that's it's an enduring problem. Okay, let's move on to point 3, vowel reduction. Now here we get issues that are sort of compounding each other, and we get this sort of cascading pronunciation disaster because vowel reduction is tied up with stress, right? And we mentioned this a little bit yesterday. We said that certain vowels like ah or or aren't always pronounced like that. They're always pronounced like that when they're stressed, but when they're not stressed, they may be pronounced like something else. That is, they may be reduced, for example, to a sound like Okay, so this is how we pronounce these sounds depends on where we place the stress. And so, for example, if we misplace the stress and do everything else correctly, what we end up saying is will not only have incorrect stress, but it may have vowels that are mispronounced. And the result may be something that's borderline unintelligible to even a native speaker of Russian. So, I mean, it may sound like a completely different word. Okay, so let's look at some tables here. This is kind of it's difficult to kind of lay this out. So this is maybe a bit of maybe overkill in some ways, but I've presented it as clearly as I can. But don't get the impression that you're going to have to sort of mentally access this table every time you go to pronounce a Russian word with these vowels, right? This is just kind of laying out all the different possibilities with a few examples. And you may notice we're also transcribing the vowels in this kind of contrived way, like ah or versus using an H, which I think is maybe helpful just to compare what we're writing in Russian with what we're actually saying. Okay, so let's look this over. Let's start with ah and or. Those are the most important, the most conspicuous vowels when it comes to reduction. So look at ah and look at the column there in the middle, the gray column with the black heading. That's the stressed syllable, right? The stressed syllable in each word is falling into that column. So there, of course, we're going to say right? We're going to pronounce the ah. We're going to give it its due treatment and pronounce it clearly. Same goes for the dark gray column right in front of that, right? The syllable right before the stressed syllable. If there's an ah there, it'll also be pronounced ah. So ah in those two situations. But everywhere else, you see, right, if we have an ah falling in any other unstressed syllable, it's going to sound like Okay, so let's just try these words and see how they kind of break down across these various columns. Okay, the word for yes is da. Okay, that's easy, only one syllable. The next, fraza. Right, and note the transcription, fraza. The second, number 3, strana. Okay, there we have 2 syllables, but the first is directly before the stressed syllable, so we say strana. We pronounce it exactly as it's written. Number 4, the country, Canada. Okay, there it's the third one that sort of falls out of favor, and we pronounce it as Canada. Number 5, here, this is a nice example to remember because we have all 3. Karandash. So there we have the first one pronounced Okay, the next letter is maybe the most important and the most difficult because the letter O can represent 3 different sounds. O, a. So this is the hardest one here when we're talking about vowel reduction. Okay, again, the middle column in black in a position directly before that, stressed syllable, we have ah, right? It's reduced. You can think of this as sort of going up. That's kind of the way I try to visualize it, at least for learning purposes. Ah. And then everywhere else we get Okay, so take the word for cat. This is actually a tomcat, a male cat. It's kot. Very easy because there's only one syllable. So of course it's stressed. Okay, number 2, city, город. Right, again, note the transcription. Number 3, zolota. First syllable is stressed, but the second two are not. Zolota. Number 4, кольцо, right? First o is immediately before the stressed syllable, so it's кольцо. Number 5, плохо. And number 6, again, a really nice example because it has all three. Хорошо. It's also a very common word. Хорошо. Okay, the next two are, they're listed here in the textbook for reference, but I must say they're a good deal less conspicuous than the I and the O. So at this stage, it's by far more important to focus on A and O when it comes to vowel reduction. If you want to master pronunciation, obviously yeah and ya are also important, but I think this is something that kind of you'll pick up on this over time. It's harder to hear when you make a mistake with these two. But let's go through the examples. Stressed yeah is, of course, yeah. Elsewhere, in any position, in the final position, right? If you have if yeah is the final letter in the word, it's also pronounced yeah. Anywhere else, it's going to be more like I, unless it's at the very beginning of the word, and that's where we hear clearly the ya. Right? The Y sound, so to speak, the kratkaya sound. Okay, so let's look at a few examples. Нет. Медведь. Okay, so that you maybe notice that it's kind of hard to hear, but it's not medvedь, right? We're not saying medvedь. Медведь, right? That first yeah is kind of shortened and it's reduced a bit to more of an I. But again, you can see why I don't think this is quite as important because it's much harder to hear this distinction. Okay, about the bear would be медведя. So again, медведя. So the first yeah is reduced a little bit, final two are not. Медведя. Number 4, swan, is лебедь. Right, so listen for that slight reduction, лебедь. Okay, about the swan would be лебедя. So лебедя. Number 6, about silver. And we're saying about here to get this yeah case ending. So it's, again, a slightly contrived example. But again, we're just interested in hearing the phonetics. Серебря. And finally, about food, еде. Okay, so there we have that initial unstressed yeah. And we say something like еде. Okay, so hopefully you see that something's going on here, but it's not, again, for day 2 of learning Russian, for God's sake, I wouldn't lose sleep over this issue. Finally, let's look at ya. It also reduces very similarly to yeah, except that in the final position, we get that to reduction that we see with right? So anyway, let's look at some examples. Ryads. Okay, that's easy. Ya, because we have only one vowel. Дядя. Right? Final ya, unstressed. Number 3, Япония. This is another nice example because we have that initial unstressed yeah. And so we don't say Япония. Yeah. well, let's pronounce it as written. Yaponia, right? But it's not. We actually don't have a ya sound anywhere in that word. We have Yaponia, Yaponia, Yaponia for Japan. Number 4, silver, a feminine adjective. That would be серебряная, серебряная. Okay, so again, that here, this is kind of again, it's hard to find examples that have only ya in the word. So we're focusing here on that final ya, right? Oh, actually, we have 2 yas, right? Серебряная, right? So that third syllable is more like bre, серебряная, серебряная. Okay, so again, really work on and o, yeah and ya, not so important. Let's look at a few more examples, and here we have the transcriptions to help you a little bit to home in on the way, what we're actually saying. Okay, so repeat after me. Он, она, ответ, дело, город, золото, золотой, советский, большой, карандаш, кошка, собака, работа, плохо, ладно, хорошо, медведь, лебедь, поле, Европа, еда, неделя, еще, философия, Россия, Япония, в Петербурге. Okay, next item has to do with consonants, right? We've covered vowels more or less already in terms of major pronunciation issues. Let's now turn to consonants. And we have this issue of voiced versus unvoiced consonants. So this is kind of a phonetic issue. Again, you may not have really thought about. But when we say a consonant is voiced, it basically means that your vocal cords are vibrating when you're pronouncing that sound. And in some cases, if you take, for example, a Z, that's maybe the most conspicuous, and you make that sound zzz, you can feel the buzzing, I mean, literally. And so, but if you pronounce basically that same sound, but without the buzzing effect, the vibration effect, you get not z, but s, s, right? So we say that z and s are a voiced, unvoiced pair, right? So there are certain consonants, and we see them here in the list, in Russian that can be grouped according to being voiced versus not voiced, unvoiced, right? V and F, Z, S, J, Sh, B, P, G, K, and D, T, right? You can think of this, same issues in English, right? If it would be like comparing V, F, Z, S. Well, here we don't have a letter really, but again, J, Sh, B, P, G, K, and D, T, right? Those are the pairs we're talking about. Okay, so the place where this is most important in Russian pronunciation is at the end of a word, right? If a word ends with a consonant that would normally be voiced, right, that is pronounced with this vibration of the vocal cords, in that final position, it's pronounced as its unvoiced equivalent. And you may have noticed this a little bit yesterday. We even mentioned very briefly where we saw this happening. So let's look at a few examples and you'll see what we are talking about. The word for lion, you see it ends in a final V. And so even though we write this word liev, that's not the way it's pronounced. It's pronounced lief, lief. And so you see again this transcription here in Cyrillic where we're writing what we're actually saying, right? Similarly with gas, right, that we have a final z. We write gaz, but we say gas, gas, right, with the final s sound. Hedgehog, yozh, is what we're writing, but we say yosh, yosh. Oak tree, we write doob, doob, but we say doop, doop. Okay, garden, we write sad, but we say sat, right? Devoicing from D to T, basically. And finally, blog, we say block, block. Okay, so those are those examples. If you want to practice this, just take these examples. That pretty much covers the important devoicings, we could call them. And again, for present purposes, we're most worried about this by far at the end of words, like in these examples. Now, one thing to note, we're going to talk in a moment about soft consonants. The same devoicing happens with soft consonants. The only difference is that instead of devoicing from a hard D to a hard T sound, you would be devoicing from a soft D sound to a soft T sound. Okay, so let's take a look at a couple of examples, even though we haven't talked about soft consonants yet. Again, you can come back and maybe review this later. The word for blood is krozh, but that final v is devoiced to more like a soft F, krosh, krosh. Okay, the word for filth is gryaz, but we say gryas, gryas, right? Devoicing Z to S. Falsehood is lozh, lozh, but we say losh, losh, right? Devoicing, again, j to sh. A ripple is a ryab, ryab, but that's not what we say. We devoice the B to a P and we say ryap, ryap. Finally, here's maybe the most common example, at least for now. A bear would be not medvedz, but medvedz, medvedz, right, with a final soft T. Okay, so that's devoicing at the end of words, right, devoicing of final consonants. Again, we're going to watch for this, and this is something we'll try to correct in class, right, because it's a very conspicuous mistake if you're not reducing these final consonants. By the way, if you've studied German, this is something you're probably used to. Okay, this also occurs in consonant clusters, but I don't want to spend too much time on this because, again, it's just not as noticeable. And so you can spend your time more productively practicing other things we've discussed today. But basically, when you have two consonants coming together in a cluster, then you tend to get assimilation. And typically, the first consonant in the cluster assimilates, that is, it becomes similar to or like the consonant following it. And so, for example, look at the word for author. We have a v and a t, and we pronounce that after, after, right? Because the v is devoicing to become more like the devoiced or unvoiced consonant t, after. Okay, so let's just go through a few examples and note what's happening. But again, don't worry too much about this at this stage. Ложка, ложка. Ногти, ногти. Сказка, сказка. Общество, общество. Водка, vodka. Less frequently, this happens where we get consonant clusters where we get assimilation to a following voiced consonant, right? So same thing, same assimilation pattern, but instead we're becoming like a voiced consonant. So for example, the word for change is zdacha, zdacha, right? Note we have a z sound even though we're writing an s, zdacha, or football, football, right? Instead of football, football. And finally, vokzal, vokzal, instead of vakzal, vokzal. Okay, let's go through a few examples. Again, we have transcriptions to help us. Город, город. Okay, watch for both vowel reduction and devoicing and so forth, right? Everything we've talked about thus far. Peterburg, Союз, Dub, ряд, сад, Чехов, народ, вид, водка, лед, снег, ёж, нож, лев, газ, медведь, лебедь, ложь, ложка, автор, сказка, вокзал, сдача. Okay, now we come to the hardest part of today's lesson, and this is something that is going to take a while. So be forgiving with yourself. It's going to take a lot of practice to become really good at pronouncing soft consonants. So again, as we mentioned earlier today, a lot of the issues we've gone over aren't really issues of pronunciation in terms of producing sounds you've never heard before, right? So the issue isn't really that you can't make these sounds. It's rather that we have various funny things going on. A lot of times it's interference from English and so on and so forth. I guess there are really two major exceptions to that. The first is the vowel U, right? Have you practiced that, by the way? Remember, E, U, right? There's that. That's a new sound. It's going to take practice to learn to make that. The other big group of sounds that are going to be hard probably are soft consonants. Okay, so it's really important to understand what's going on here so that you can practice it. And this is another thing that it seems like we explain it a lot and students always forget it. I think they just they think it's not very important or something. But this is, in terms of phonetics, this is one of the most important features of Slavic, including Russian, right? Is this hard versus soft distinction. Because this is going to affect not only our pronunciation, but later the endings we add to words, for example. They're going to be hard endings versus soft endings. So this distinction is just everywhere in the language, and it's something we really need to be aware of. Okay, what do we mean when we say a consonant is soft? Well, first, let's back up a little bit and say that when we think about normal consonant sounds that we're used to from English, we're usually talking about hard consonants. So, for example, when we think about a T in English, we're basically thinking what Russians would call a hard T, like cat or tada. Or there's a good example, tada. That's a hard T, hard D. So when we think T in English, when we think about a D sound in English, we're thinking basically about hard consonants. So when we're transitioning to Russian, it's not the hard consonants that are going to give us trouble. That's what we're used to. The issue is softening those hard consonants. Okay, so how on earth do we do that? What does that even mean? Well, again, a soft consonant is the more technical term is a palatalized consonant. That means that the tongue position is up near the palate, the roof of your mouth, basically, up near the top and the front of your mouth. It's much easier, instead of this kind of technical explanation, to think of the vowel needed to get your tongue in that position. And we talked about it a bit yesterday. E, right? E. That's the short answer to how do you produce a soft consonant. You need to get your tongue in the E position. Okay, everyone can do that. Why? How do I know that? Because you can all make the sound E, right? There's no problem making that sound. Okay, so make it E and hold it. E. Okay, that's the tongue position you need to make a palatalized or softened consonant. I think it's also helpful, as we mentioned, to transition from the vowel E to the consonant I kratkaya or Y, right? Kind of like in English Y. E, Y. E, Y. And I didn't mention yesterday, but even though I kratkaya, we can think of it as like English Y, like Y, Russians, if they're speaking very clearly, you may hear this sort of rasping sound, yeah, yeah, yeah. You can probably hear that, right? And that maybe hearing that makes it a little bit easier to remember that this I kratkaya is a consonant, right? So anyway, back to our example, I, yeah. Try to work back and forth between those two sounds. I, yeah, 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 yeah. That's where your tongue needs to be. That's the basic action you need to be doing with your tongue. Now, the key is to keep your tongue there and then go and do whatever it takes to pronounce the consonant in question. For example, a D. Eads, eads, eads. Okay, now practice it. Again, it's going to take practice. But notice what happens. Again, the issue here is overcoming tendencies from, for example, English. If that's your native language, you're going to, every time you go to pronounce a D, every muscle in your, every nerve in your body basically is going to want to make a hard D. And so what happens is, even if you initially have your tongue in the right position, E, it's going to want to drop back into more of like an ah position in order to kind of be lazy and make a hard D. So E, ah, duh, right? If you make a D with your tongue in that back position, of course, you're going to get a hard D. So let's practice, for example, a soft T. Okay, well, first let's have a hard T. At, at. Or again, this example, ta-da, ta-da. So ta, 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 ta. No one has any problem making that hard T sound. So let's try a soft T. Eats, eats, tss, tss, eats. Okay, try that. Now again, this may be hard even to hear that at first, although hopefully when I say it really emphatically, you can hear the difference. Ta versus chi, chi, ta, ta, ch, ch. Your ear may also want to hear that as a ch. That sometimes happens, right? But note that ch is a different sound in Russian. We have a different letter for that after all. Ch is different from ch, ch. Okay, so anyway, we're going to go through some examples here. Before we do, there's one really, really important thing to review, and that is, how do we know that we have a soft T versus a hard T? Okay, well, again, we can think of the hard T as sort of our default, because after the Bolshevik reform of the orthography, if we see a T on the page, we basically assume that it's hard, unless it's followed by a soft sign or one of the 5 soft vowels. Those are E, and also then the 4 soft vowels we learned on day 1. Ya, you, your, yeah. Okay, let's think about this for a moment. We could just memorize that as a list without really thinking about it. But in fact, this is actually kind of easy to remember, and you see what's really going on here. Why would these 5 letters, E, ya, your, you, yeah, why would they, so to speak, mark a preceding consonant as soft? Well, because they involve those 2 sounds we just talked about, E and ya, right? E, the vowel E, and then ya, you, yeah, your, right? They all start with this ya consonant. So that's the exact position of the tongue that we just talked about as being necessary to make a soft consonant. Historically, that's where these soft consonants came from. They came from an ordinary hard consonant being followed by this e, y sort of action, and those sounds sort of blended together to produce new sounds, these soft consonants that are so characteristic of Slavic languages. And again, those sounds didn't exist in, for example, Greek. And so in any Slavic language you study, there's going to be this issue of how do you spell these things, right? Now, some Slavic languages may have, for example, Serbian Cyrillic may have sort of different letters for example, a soft N. But the Russian convention is to use the soft sign or one of these 5 so-called soft vowels. When we see that written on the page, it's telling us that the preceding consonant is soft. Okay, so enough. Let's get to some examples and look at some. Let's start with N, right? So hard N versus soft N. Try to make a soft N. In, in, in. N, 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 n. That's easy versus in, n, n. Okay, so try that, and now let's look at some examples. First of all, with some hard N's. Notebook, notebook. Народ, новый. Он, студент. Okay, so hard is easy. Let's keep that in mind. Now let's look at the soft N's. День, день. You may notice that D there is also soft. День. Жизнь. Нет. Они. So for example, that's not ani or something. It's они, они. And finally, Япония, Япония. Okay, let's start with hard D. And now remember that if this is at the end of a word, it's going to actually sound like a hard T. So we have a lot going on here. Anyway, let's practice the hard examples. Сад, народ, анекдот, ладно, мода. Okay, no problem making those hard sounds. Let's practice soft D. Eads, eads, eads. День, день. Okay, how do we know that's a soft D? Because it's followed by yeah, right? It's followed by one of these yeah, these soft vowel letters. Будильник, будильник. Люди, люди. Студент. Дело, дело. Okay, let's take T. So starting with hard T. Нет. Привет. Анекдот. Okay, let's take T, starting with the easy part, hard T. Нет. Привет. Анекдот. Золото. Билет. Now for soft T, again, practice the tongue position. E, eats, eats. Note that this isn't sh, right? Eats. Mats. So make sure you're not saying much, right? Mats. Мать, писать, смерть, эти, тема. Okay, now for L, hard L, again, shouldn't be a problem. Ладно, плохой, осел, журнал, блог. Now soft L, иль. Right, so try that. Il, рубль, жаль, люди, неделя, большой, баль. One thing I didn't mention is that some of these soft letters may be easier. You may find them easier to hear and pronounce, for example, at the end of a word because they're so conspicuous. If they're in the middle of a word and something else follows, then it can be a bit harder to hear them and pronounce them. But for example, the word большой, баль, баль, большой, большой. Okay, S, русский, сон, стихи, писать. And now soft, Русь, осень, лосось, месяц, лев, вопрос, давай. Now compare that with любовь. Now there, that's actually a soft f, right? Because we're getting the devoicing. So again, at this point, we've got a lot going on. In any one example we look at, we may have not only softness, but also devoicing, and then we've got the vowel reduction. So there's a lot to get used to here. Okay, the next word, Soviet, that's a true soft V, right? No devoicing there. Soviet, Soviet. And finally, vid, vid. B, учебник, dub, with devoicing. Боль, боль. Hard B, soft L. Okay, now soft B, рябь. Okay, we know that's actually a soft P we're getting there because of the devoicing. Similarly with prorub, prorub. And finally, true soft B, билет, билет, билет. Okay, P, группа, поле, soup, and soft P, пить, пиво, пять. M, hard M, mama, музыка, soft M, 7, 8, медведь. R, автор, подарок, soft R, словарь, царь. Finally, Z, газ, there's the devoicing, золото, зять, зима. Okay, so I think if you're comparing all these soft consonants, you probably noticed that the last batch we did, the last 6, it's a little bit harder to hear, especially with R, maybe, and Z. And so again, I think for beginners, I wouldn't be too hung up on those. I would, again, focus my attention on the top of the page in the textbook there, especially with the, te, and n, also L. Okay, one final note today. There are a few consonants, those hushing consonants we talked about at the end of yesterday's lesson, that are either hard or soft by definition. They're considered hard or soft by definition, and that's kind of something we don't really need to get into. But it basically means that if one of these hushing consonants is followed by a soft sign, that actually does not affect their pronunciation. So that may be a little bit confusing. Again, I think ultimately this kind of just it's not really an issue, so I wouldn't even worry about it very much, but we're just pointing that out. For example, look at the word for a match, like a soccer match, 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 and compare that with noch, noch. Okay, so that is not a hard versus soft ch. Russian doesn't really have that, unlike, for example, Polish or something, right? It doesn't, it's lost that distinction more or less. And so why would they write a soft sign there on the word noch? Well, we're going to learn more about that later. And actually, it's going to be a while. I think even in it'll be until book 2 before we get to that. But it's acting as a kind of visual marker that gives us a clue as to how this noun is going to change its endings, basically. So we're going to postpone that discussion for quite a while. Just again, for now, note that it's not affecting pronunciation. Similarly with je, nosh. Okay, there's the devoicing, of course. Same thing with losh, right? We just get a simple devoicing to a sh. That soft sign isn't really doing anything there in terms of pronunciation. Next with sh, karandash. Compare that with mysh, chitayesh, right? No difference in pronunciation. Finally, sh, remember from yesterday, that's a double consonant. Hold it for twice as long, roughly. Borsh. Compare that with viesh. Again, no difference, no true hard, soft distinction there. So we'll understand what that soft sign is doing better at some point down the road. Okay, so we've covered a lot in days 1 and 2, and the lesson has been a little bit longer than I hope it normally will be. Yesterday we learned the alphabet. Today we've learned again these 5 principles for good pronunciation, some of which you're going to take some getting used to. So you shouldn't expect to master this overnight. It'll take a lot of practice. Tomorrow we'll look at some minor details, sort of some unusual exceptions to the general rules we've given. And day 4 we'll look at how to write Russian cursive, and then we'll be off and running with Russian grammar. So until next time, до свидания, товарищи.